broad section of language. And our first main division under this were the foundations of language. And we really identified two different kinds of foundations of language. We talked about structural linguistics, also called classical linguistics, made the distinction between lang and parole, one being the formal aspects of language, your structural aspects of language, and we went through the four different main structural components of language. Syntax and semantics. Parole, which is language in use. Emphasize that the lang part, the language structure doesn't change, but the language in use does, with lots of different convention changes and stuff like that. One thing I really did emphasize last week, and again, especially with the structural aspect of language, the lang, and we've talked about this in the interpersonal as well, is that misconception that a lot of people have that some languages, when you're looking at just the structural aspects of language, like the phonemes, morphemes, syntax, semantics, some people have this idea that some languages are inherently more complex and more difficult than other languages. But that's clearly dispelled when you look at one of the things we were talking about later in terms of the universality of language acquisition, that all infants everywhere, regardless of culture, regardless of language, they learn their native language at pretty much the exact same age and the exact same rate and even the same stages as any other language. And that pretty much dispels the notion that some languages, just those structural aspects, the phonemes, morphemes, syntax, and semantics, that some languages are structurally more complex than others. Because if it was true that Russian was a more complex language than English, then Russian babies wouldn't be doing until age 3 what American babies could do at age 2 and stuff like that. So in terms of the structural aspect of the language, there is no difference at all in terms of the complexity or the difficulty of learning a language as your native language. And I think we mentioned this last week as well, and this is a good follow-up point to that. You will find that learning a second language, some languages are going to be easier than others to learn as a second language, but that's not because the language itself is structurally more simple or more complex. What's going to make the difference in terms of how easy it is to learn a second language? Absolutely. How similar or close it is to your native language. If you already speak French, you're going to be able to pick up Spanish or Italian pretty easy, much more easy than you would Japanese or Korean. If you already speak Japanese, you're going to be able to pick up Korean or Mandarin Chinese probably much easier than you would pick up Spanish or English or French. So structurally, there's no difference in the complexity of the language, and that's why as a native language, everybody learns it pretty much the same. But you will find learning a second language can be easier, but it's not because the language is structurally more simple, it's because of how similar the language is. In all of those aspects, I mean, when you're looking at things like the phonemes, the sounds, the more similar the sounds are, it's going to be easier to learn. You don't have to learn a bunch of new sounds. Obviously, when you're talking about the morphological roots, any language, for example, that uses Latin as a lot of the roots, like your Western European Romance languages, like Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, they all are very Latin-oriented. Our languages, too, we use a lot of Latin roots in our language as well. But when you look at something like Chinese or Japanese or Korean, they're not using Latin roots and Greek roots like we do in our language. So that's going to make it easier as well. And of course, the syntax. I was talking about things like in some of those Eastern languages like Japanese and Korean, the structural syntactic arrangement of the sentence is subject-verb or subject-object-verb, whereas in your Western European languages, English included, your structural syntactic arrangement is subject-verb-object. So the more different the language, the harder it's going to be to learn as a second language, but that doesn't mean the language itself is structurally more complex.
I know it's not verbal, but could computer programming be fit into our definition of language at all?
It's a language per se, sure. I mean, it is a computer language, yeah, absolutely. That's a good thing to bring up. And it's a whole different thing when you're talking about the processing of it. But technically speaking, a language is a set of signals and symbols with agreed upon meaning. And so, yeah, I mean, just like we would say American Sign Language is a language, computer language is a language.
Has there been any studies that include children with learning computer programming to see how they pick it up or something like that as compared to adults?
There probably has been. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with that. I know that a lot of, just because of when children are in this younger stage, their mind is more primed for learning. And just like, actually I did mention this last week, but just like a younger child can learn a second language easier than an adult can, because they're still learning and they haven't become just as conditioned in thinking in one language, there could be good indications that a younger kid could learn programming language maybe easier than an adult could, because they're not just conditioned to thinking in terms of one kind of set of symbol system. That's a really excellent question. So that's just some of the background stuff that we did with that structural linguistics. And then the other thing we spent most of our time on was generative grammar, Chomsky's theory, and there's many things involved, but the main thing that we focused on there was the LAD. What's LAD, besides spelling out the word lad?
Language acquisition.
Yeah, the language acquisition device, which is this innate idea that we have, you know, a natural, biological, or innate ability to acquire language. This is an inferential theory. What does it mean to say something's an inferential theory? Because as soon as we get into activation theory, that's an inferential theory as well.
It's implied to a larger context, it's not direct study.
Yeah, you can't directly observe the thing. You can observe the effects of something. But like when we're talking about the language acquisition device, you can't look in the human brain and say, there's the ability right there that gives us the innate, you know, acquisition of language. But because of the things that you can observe in a child's acquisition of language, you can infer, theoretically, we must have some kind of natural innate ability to learn and acquire language. So basically the LAD, the language acquisition device, it's not an actual thing that you're going to be able to point to on an MRI or something like that. It's just this inferential theoretical concept that humans must have an innate ability to acquire language. And the main reason, and this is where we spent most of our detail, is how that's inferred is because there's so many different things about the child's acquisition of language that cannot be explained by regular basic learning theory. One of the things we went into was the uniformity in language. If we did not have this innate ability when the mind is programmed to learn language, there is no way that we can explain how all children everywhere go through the same exact stages in the same exact order even in learning and acquiring language. And I even made the comment last week that even a child that's communicatively impaired and learns American Sign Language as an alternative communication system, they even go through the same stages in the same order. There's no way that that could be explained by learning theory. The second thing that we went into was I think this was probably the third thing, was all the creative aspects of language, all the things that children do that they're not taught. And anytime that you have a difference between input and output, in other words, the kids are doing and saying things different than what they hear, then learning theory can't really account for that, because learning theory basically says that the child hears, they learn, they imitate, they reinforce. And we talked about some things, for example, like the creative aspects of language in terms of their ability to generate a potentially infinite number of sentences and combinations of ideas from a finite number of words, lexical innovations. What's a lexical innovation?
Like making up a word when you have a gap in your vocabulary.
Yeah, they got a gap in their vocabulary. You know, lexical means word. You've got a gap in your vocabulary, and so what they do is they make up words. We gave examples of things like the denominal verbs and the agent nominals, where they make a noun out of a verb or a verb out of a noun, making up words. I mean, obviously, learning theory couldn't explain that if nobody taught them those words. And we also talked about morphological overgeneralizations. What's that?
Like when you say, oh, you know, bike is pluralized bike, or you pluralize mouse is like mouses.
Yeah, well, you know, morphology, you know, the morphemes are suffixes, prefixes, and the roots of words. In this particular case, it's overgeneralizing the suffixes beyond the scope of what they've been taught. And then the other thing that, you know, we did mention, this was actually the second thing that can't be accounted for by learning theory, is their acquisition of the structural characteristics of language. They learn the structure, and it's usually not reinforced and not taught that much at that early of an age. And I even talked about the idea of telegraphic speech, how somehow a child has the ability, when you give this really long, complex sentence, they have the ability to key in on what the 2 or 3 essential words are. And again, I mean, there's just no way that could be explained by just basic kind of imitation, you know, sort of theory. Isn't that where we left off? At the end of the generative grammar?
Yep.
Julie?
Could we ever, or has anyone ever done a study that could possibly say that it's not that languages are easy, like on the same level of easiness, that maybe it's that children's brains like have a need for learning a language by a certain time, so their brains like work to learn it, rather than like the language is just as easy as any other language.
Like the
You know what I
brain
mean?
rises to the challenge,
Yeah,
sort of thing?
because they need to know.
I don't know how that could be studied, and I'm not sure if it has been studied, because it is a really good question, though. Most of the research that leads to the conclusion that languages are relatively equal isn't just the uniformity. The uniformity of learning is one thing, but also in terms of just structurally looking at the components of a language, that if you're really looking at it objectively, then one language just really isn't that any more difficult. I mean, for somebody that, you know, is a linguist, they can look at the structural aspects of Russian, for example, and say, yeah, that's really different from English, but it's really no more complex than it is to learn language. So it's not so much a study of the kids as much as studying the language and saying that the structural characteristics, the phonetic sounds are really no different in one language compared to the other. But that's a good question for you. Okay, well, all that was number one here, which was dealing with, you know, the foundations of language, A being structural linguistics, B being classical or being generative grammar. We go into a new thing, a new area then here with language, and that's looking more at language processing, how the mind actually processes language, or at least some of the concepts and some of the theories related to this. This next theory, there's really no way of giving you a concise little single sentence that defines it. It's just a phenomenally broad theory in terms of its theoretical scope, the amount of things that it can explain in terms of the mind's processing of language, and that's activation theory. Again, this is a very, very, very broad theory in terms of its theoretical scope, and you'll see, I mean, we're not going to cover every single thing that activation theory can explain, but just with the range of things that we cover and the kinds of examples and the diversity of examples, you'll see how tremendously broad this theory is. This is also an inferential theory in that you can't really see activation in the sense that we're talking about. I mean, you can clearly see things that are happening in the brain through, you know, things like brain scans and MRIs, but you know, you can't really observe these kinds of things in terms of language processing, but yet it can be inferred by looking at certain characteristics and certain aspects of how we process language. The main thing that activation theory deals with, and this by no means is a comprehensive definition, is the idea of conceptual stimulation. In other words, what's meant by activation when you're talking about language is the stimulation of some kind of language-related concepts. Again, just tremendously broad. Basically, what it's saying is that whenever we're processing language, both encoding and decoding, now, you know, I'll get more specific on those later, but I would assume that everybody knows the words. You know, encoding is where we're creating words, we're going from our thought or whatever the idea is into expressing it in language, and decoding is the reverse. It's where we're hearing language and we're interpreting the meaning and assigning meaning to it. Well, the idea of activation theory is dealing with what's going on mentally in terms of the conceptual stimulation or activation of concepts from words, which would be your decoding, or activating words from concepts, which would be your encoding. I think that one of the best ways to kind of think of this is something like, especially when you're dealing with how easy or difficult it is to conceptually stimulate, you have two main influences on how the amount of stimulation that's required to conceptually activate words. And the two main influences are the frequency and strength of activation. In other words, the more often something is activated, the less conceptual stimulation it takes to activate it. Just kind of makes sense, right? A word or a concept that you frequently think about or you frequently activate, you don't have to, it doesn't take as much conceptual stimulation to activate that word. When you're at a loss for a word, chances are it's not words that you use all the time. You're not really very likely to forget your own name or, you know, forget your mother's name or something like that. But a vocabulary term that you heard once in a class and then 3 weeks later you asked to remember the vocabulary word, that actually takes more conceptual stimulation. Now, one of the big implications here is it's not just think of the implications for memory, even though we're going to deal more with memory eventually later when we talk about some of the comprehension and retention aspects. It's not so much just what we remember, it's a matter of how much mental activation is required to remember something. And things that you frequently activate, things that are frequently activated, it doesn't take as much conceptual stimulation in order to retrieve that concept, or in order to activate what that word is. Also, the strength of the association. The stronger something is associated, or the stronger concepts and words are related to each other, it also takes less conceptual stimulation when it's something that's a stronger kind of connection. I think a great analogy here is the idea of, if you think of something like an electric stove. You know how if you turn up an electric, not gas, but if you turn up, you turn on the burner on an electric stove and let it really heat up, and you turn off the stove. If you turn the stove on again in just like a minute, it doesn't take as long to heat up, and it doesn't take as much energy for it to heat up. If you turn the stove off and leave it off for an hour and then come back to it, it takes a lot longer for it to heat up, and it takes more energy for it to heat back up. That's, I think, a pretty good analogy in terms of this relationship here. The frequent association and the strong association, that's like turning the stove right back on a minute after you turn it off. It doesn't take as much energy to reactivate the stove, and it doesn't take as long for the stove to activate to its full heat. On the other hand, something that's not as frequently associated, or something that's not as strong in terms of its association, it takes more conceptual energy to activate what that context is. There's a whole bunch of practical applications of this kind of thing when you're talking about things like educational applications, for example. One of the things I know that some students do, I don't know how many undergraduates do this, I know that a lot of graduate students do this, where at the end of every week or something like that, you sit back and you rewrite your notes from your classes. Well, for a lot of students, that it's enough to take notes at one time, let alone going back and writing them and rewriting them. But for any of you that have ever tried that, one of the things that you probably find is every time you rewrite your notes, it takes less information the second time you write your notes in order to activate or explain the same amount of information. You might start out with 5 pages of notes, and by the time you rewrite them the third or the fourth time, you've got that same amount of information in just 1 or 2 pages. Because as you go through the notes each time, you're more frequently associating those concepts, and it takes less key words down there to activate what the understanding is and to activate the concept. Another kind of practical application would be something like when you rehearse your speech, obvious kind of application. What are you doing when you're rehearsing your speech? You're not just memorizing your speech. The fact that you keep going through a speech and rehearsing it, it actually takes less conceptual stimulation when you're delivering your speech to reactivate what those words are and reactivate what those concepts are. Another practical, everyday educational application is something like talking about concepts outside of the classroom. Can you see what a big difference that makes? I mean, if the only time you talk about a particular theory or a particular concept is once a week or twice a week when you're sitting in a class, well, I mean, just think, that's going to take a lot more activation than 4 weeks later when you're studying for the exam or taking the exam to remember those concepts. But if you integrate those concepts and integrate those ideas into your day-to-day kind of life, that seems especially easy with something like communication, because it's something that we're all doing all the time, and you integrate those things into your life, or you notice examples of these things in your day-to-day life. You're thinking about them, you're talking about them, that kind of thing, then it really takes much less brain power to remember all that stuff, because you're frequently activating it. And if you can relate these things to your day-to-day life, then you're creating a stronger association as well. And again, it just takes less in terms of activating what it is. I think this is also one of the benefits of something like giving quizzes in a class. Now, there's only one class I do this in, which is the research methods class, as some of you well know. But one of the potential benefits there is, instead of getting this information in class and then not really having to study it until 4 weeks later when it's time for an exam, you get it in class, and about a week and a half later you have a quiz, and then within about 2 weeks after that you have the exam. And I think when you have these quizzes, it's a lot more likely that you're going to remember the information on the exam, because you've activated that information and you've activated those concepts more commonly. Also, even in terms of things like a semantic network. If you look at that handout that you got, everybody get the handout that came around? This is just one example of a semantic network, and that's what you got on the bottom here, is a semantic network. And what a semantic network is, it's a conceptual relation of words and concepts to each other. In other words, you've got a network of semantically related concepts or words. Well, everybody's semantic network is gonna be different. This particular one is centered around the central concept of red. And what you're looking at in terms of the way that all of these different words and concepts are related to red, these are basically how much or how little activation is required to go from the red concept to one of the other concepts. Your shorter distances that are more direct, that's where you're dealing with things that require less conceptual stimulation. You either more frequently associate them, or there's a stronger association. Now again, this is just one example. Everybody has their own semantic network. But you look at the network off of red. Well, if you look just off to the left, obviously one activated concept when you think of red is red as a color, right? So it just makes sense then that you're gonna spin off of other colors. And in this particular case, orange and green seem a little closer, more associated to red. And then you see yellow a little further away, but you also see yellow that would be associated with like orange and green. Another thing that you would activate with the concept of red instead of just a color is maybe something like flowers. And then you can see a little further away, because you're more likely to think of red probably as a color than just flowers, but you think of flowers. And so what's the closest concept in terms of, at least for this example, when somebody thinks of red as a flower, they, at least in this example, they think of roses. But then you have the concept of roses, and then that activates and is related to other kinds of flowers, like a violet or flowers in general. And then you can see, if you're going off to the right or to the bottom, other concepts that would be related to the idea of red. You've got fire, and then you can see how that's related to concepts like fire engine and house. You could also see it relating to something like apples, which then is related to other fruits, like pears, which aren't red. That's why it's a little further away. And cherries, and you can see the relationship with direct with red, because we think of cherries as being red. And then once you think of fire engine, you can see how that would be related to another emergency vehicle, like an ambulance, and then related to other kinds of vehicles, like trucks, buses, etc. So again, what all of these are, and then I didn't mention the sunsets, sunrises, those kinds of things at the bottom. All of these are just one example of a semantic network, and the way that this would relate to the frequency and strength of activation is concepts that we associate more frequently. These are going to be the ones that have a closer association to your central concept, and they're going to be more direct. Concepts that are less frequently activated or less strongly activated, these are ones that are going to be further away, and they're ones that are going to be indirect. And you can see how one concept relates to one thing, but then that links to something else, like red links to roses, but then roses leads to violets and that sort of thing. So it's just a tremendously fascinating idea, and I'm going to give you a whole bunch of other specific kinds of examples when we get to some of the other detail, in terms of how the mind is conceptually stimulating words and concepts. Words and concepts that we more frequently associate, it takes less conceptual stimulation in order to activate them. Words and concepts that we more strongly associate together, it takes less conceptual stimulation to activate. So activation is saying the conceptual stimulation of words and concepts. It's both stimulating a concept from a word, stimulating a word from a concept. What influences this conceptual stimulation? The frequency and the strength of the association. Things that are more frequently associated create less, needs less conceptual stimulation. Things that are more strongly associated requires less conceptual stimulation. And again, one of the big practical applications here is anytime you're trying to remember something, anytime you're trying to learn something, you can use this mental process, in your benefit. Create strong associations. Frequently make those associations. And when it actually comes time to remember something, it's going to take much less brain power to actually remember it, because it takes less conceptual stimulation. Questions or anything at this point? We're going to get into a lot more examples, and you'll see more in terms of what's going on here. I had also mentioned that activation relates both to encoding and decoding. Encoding is going from the thought or the idea to the word. Decoding is going from the word to the meaning. So when you're talking about activating a word from a concept, that's encoding. When you're talking about activating a concept from a word, that's decoding. Again, I would think that should be familiar to most of you. Some just fascinating things in terms of encoding examples. One of the things that's been studied a lot with activation theory, again, you can see the inferential nature, are speech errors. There's a lot of speech errors that are just day-to-day common things that activation theory can easily explain. One thing, and this is just I think a really fascinating thing, and that's what's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Tip of the tongue phenomenon is where you know something, and it's right on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't quite remember it. Let's say you've got that, when you're trying to remember somebody's name, and his name's George, and somebody says, well, is it Frank? And you go, no. They go, is it Bob? No. Is it Otto? No. How can you remember what something isn't if you can't remember what it is? And there's really very little things that could explain that. How do you know what something isn't if you don't remember what it is? Activation theory can explain that. Even though you don't remember what the person's name is, you recognize the absence of the conceptual stimulation. It's, again, I think an analogy here would be something like a pilot light. You know that pilot light is going, you know that flame is there, but when you finally activate the right idea or you activate the right word, it's where the pilot light has ignited the main fuel, and then you've got, fire in the furnace or something like that. So one of the very few ways that you could theoretically explain how can you remember what something isn't if you can't remember what it is activation theory. Even though you don't remember that his name is George, you can recognize the absence of conceptual stimulation. Another really loose analogy, well, I don't know if this is analogy as much as a metaphor, the light bulb thing there, that lights up in front of, on top of the person's head, that's a good example of, at least a metaphor, of activation. You might not remember what the name is, but the moment that you do remember, or somebody says the right name, the light lights up. And again, that's how we can remember what something isn't, even though we can't remember what it is. And another good example of that same thing is what some people do to try to remember something is they'll maybe like go through the alphabet in terms of, does it start with an A? No. Does it start with a B? No. Does it start with a C? No. Well, again, if you don't remember what it is, how do you know what it doesn't start with? You're recognizing the absence of conceptual stimulation. And we do have phonetic memory, so as soon as you get to G, as you're going through the names, you go, yeah, it's a G. It starts with a G. Well, again, you don't remember the name yet as George, but you do remember, wow, it's a G. You even recognize the conceptual stimulation of the phonetic sound G, and you know it's a G. And so you start going through the different G words, and when you finally, or names, and when you finally get to George, you recognize that conceptual stimulation. Don't some of you do that when you're, whether it's somebody's name or the name of a song or the name of a movie or something like that, you go through different letters and say, does it start with this, does it start with this? And a lot of times when you finally get to the letter that it starts with, even though you don't remember it yet, you recognize that's what it starts with. And again, one of the very few things that could explain how you know what it starts with and you can't even remember what it is because you recognize the conceptual stimulation of that particular phonetic sound. Another good example of encoding with, in terms of the tip of the tongue is not so much a speech error as much as a temporary speech gap. Another good example of an encoding error, though, is what's referred to as a blend. And again, we all do this. A blend is where, at the moment you're thinking of a concept, you equally activate two words. And the speech mechanism is incapable of saying two words simultaneously, so what ends up coming out is a blend of those two words. Most of the time when we're encoding language, we activate single individual words, so that's why individual words come out. But if you're talking about influencing somebody, and at that moment you're not sure whether you're going to use the word convince or the word persuade, if you equally activate both, what ends up coming out is something like consuade or convince, right? It's a complete nonsensical word, but you can see where it comes from. It comes from blending two different words. Activation theory can explain that because you have equally activated two words, and the only thing you can do is say both, and you can't say both words simultaneously, so what ends up coming out is a blend of the two. Another good example is, let's say you're going to give an example of some Western European language, and at that moment you're not sure if you're going to say French or Spanish, and so what you end up saying is something like Spanish or French. You've just kind of blended these two things together. Two examples stick out in my head where this happened. One was a little more embarrassing than the other one. There was a group of female students in a class, and I was addressing them, and I was going to say, how are you girls doing today? And at the same time, I realized that that might be offensive to college-age females. You're ladies, you're women, you're certainly not girls. And so I equally activated ladies and girls, and what I ended up saying was, how are you gaydies doing today? One that was more embarrassing was, I'm not gonna do anything too extreme here, but I was asking a class of, how they're doing with the reading material, and at the one hand, I was gonna say, how are you doing with your book? And on the other hand, I was gonna say, how are you doing with your reading? And what ended up coming out was, I asked them, how are you guys doing with your breathing? Because I activated book and reading at the same time. So, I mean, I'm sure that all of you have probably done this, from time to time, maybe not that exact example. But again, there's very, very, very few things that can explain that. Why in the world would we say two words that are a blend of each other? It's because we equally activated two different words, and we can't say two different words, so we blend the two together. And again, usually we're activating one word more than another. Another example of where this happens, and this isn't a blend, but it's a good example of, not a speech error in terms of saying something incorrect, but it's a good example in terms of how the frequency and the strength of association can make you say something that you don't want to say. I would think, at least for people that use profanity in their day-to-day life, they use it very frequently, the profane versions of darn or heck or shoot or, many other kinds of variations there, and they're in a context where they know they should not use profanity, like a classroom. I know, Alex, last week when you were giving your presentation, you did not mean to say the profane version of shoot the couple times that you did, but it comes out anyway. You might not even realize that you did it.
No, it doesn't.
When you're talking to your parents, I'm sure that you would rather use a word like darn or fudge rather than some other possible profane versions. But for some people, if you use a lot of profanity day to day, you might end up popping out with the profane word instead of the non-profane word, just because of how often you use it. And sometimes even, how strongly you might feel about that exclamation, you end up saying the profane word instead of the non-profane word, even though you really didn't mean to. So, another good kind of example of that speech mistake that can be explained by activation theory. If you're used to saying the other version of darn more than darn, there is a likelihood that you'll say, the profane version.
Can activation also occur, what if you don't, for instance, you don't use those words, but you're constantly surrounded by individuals that do?
Would you be more likely to say it, you mean?
Right, could environment also influence activation, like the people that you're surrounded by?
I suppose it could, yeah. You're not saying it, so you're not activating it. You're hearing it a lot, though, and so you might be more likely to say it.
As though it is day to day. Like, even with, outside of cussing and everything, just like something that is frequently, again, you're frequently around it, and it's constantly being used, but you yourself don't use it, but you do take notice of it, or subconscious notice of it.
Yeah, if I could, now that's kind of on the peripheral edge of activation, but it's really a fascinating question. You could say some of those things just because you hear them. One of the things that came to mind when you were explaining that is a young child sometimes popping up with words because they hear them. And you hear your little 5-year-old say some of these things, you go, where in the world did you hear that? But one of the things that could make it kind of the reverse, depending upon how strong you feel about it, if you, for example, have a strong feeling against using profanity in day-to-day language, then when you hear other people use profanity, that's going to kind of create the opposite effect, because you're not strongly associating your feeling with the use of that profane word. You're more creating your strong feeling against the use of that word, so you might actually be less likely to use that word. So you have to kind of look at both of these things in conjunction with each other.
Kind of like building off of that makes me think of, I don't know if this is related, but if you hang out with someone a lot, like you make a new friend, you start hanging out with them a lot, and they have certain things that they say, and you kind of find yourself picking up on things that they say. Is that kind of like that too?
Yeah, that's kind of like that. I think that relates to what Alex is talking about as well. Again, really on the peripheral edge of activation, but even something like dialect acquisition. When you go and live in a certain part of the country that's different from where you're from, you'll sometimes find yourself picking up certain characteristics of that dialect. You don't do it intentionally. You just live in the UP for a little while, and you find yourself saying something like, you betcha, or hey, or something like that.
You get a couple drinks in you, and it really starts to loosen up the jaw.
And it all starts coming out. Maybe, you spend some time in the Pennsylvania Valley area or Ohio, and you suddenly find yourself saying wash instead of wash, which is one of the characteristics of that dialect region. Or you spend some time in the South, and then you find yourself saying y'all instead of, you all or something like that. That's a contraction that's frequently Southern. Aaron, were you going to say something a minute ago?
No.
Okay. So just some of these common examples. Another good example of an encoding activation error You've all heard what a Freudian slip is. Now, traditionally, people think of Freudian slips as just being, something that has, sexual undertones, but it doesn't have to. Essentially, a Freudian slip is where you're thinking something, but you want to say something different, and you end up saying what you're really thinking instead of what you wanted to say. My example of using profanity when you didn't mean to use profanity, like in a class or talking to your parents or something like this, or to a child, you certainly don't want to use those words around a young kid. That would be an example of Freudian slips. You can think of some other ones as well, a couple that I jotted down. One is somebody saying something like, well, I really disagree with many of Freud's theory. Or, well, that's one way, I guess, of defining it. Or, well, she was really the most attractive, the most active person on the tennis court. You can see that if you're thinking something, and you don't mean to say what you're thinking, but if you're thinking it more strongly than what you actually intend to say, then you could see you end up popping up with the thing that you didn't mean to say, because that's really what you're thinking, you're thinking it more strongly. Again, lots and lots and lots of different kinds of examples. So those are good examples of encoding activation, and just fascinating how much it can explain. We also have lots of examples of decoding with activation as well. One of the most obvious examples, and this is actually part of psychoanalysis and used a lot of time in psychological techniques and things like this, and that's word association. You've all seen this, right, where they do these word associations. They say a word, and you say the first word that pops into your mind. Well, what's the underlying theoretical basis of that? It's really looking at things like how strongly and how frequently you associate these two things. So if somebody says father, and your first reaction is, let me not use that example. Let's say that somebody says dog, and your first reaction is scared. Well, obviously, that indicates for that person, they have this strong association about being scared of dogs, or maybe some experience that happened in the past. Somebody says a concept like mother, and your initial response is love, rather than father, which would, kind of be semantically related there. Well, that shows a pretty strong relationship. So the whole idea of word association is basically based on this concept and this idea. When somebody says a word, and the first word that comes to our mind, oftentimes, is the word or the concept that we more strongly associate and we more frequently associate. Even, again, something like saying the word mother, for a lot of people, they say the word father because they're semantically related. You say the word dog, and most people are likely to probably say what?
Cat.
Yeah, say cat. And really, there's no more association between a dog and a cat than there is between a platypus and a moose. It's just that we tend to associate dogs and cats together, because of, being two common kind of domestic sort of animals. If we were just phonetically activating it, in terms of words that are similar in their spelling, rather than the conceptual association, then when somebody would say mother, your first reaction would likely be something like moth, which I think is the word that comes right before mother in the dictionary. And when you say cat, instead of saying dog, the word I think that comes after cat in the dictionary would be something like cataclysm, or at least that would be closely related. So, we're not associating these words in terms of the way they're spelled or the way they sound. Most of the time, the words that we associate together are because of their conceptual relationship. And again, how often, we associate these kind of concepts together. Lots and lots of examples, both in terms of our frequency of activation and the strength of the activation. Can you see the inferential nature of the theory? When we're talking about things like all these speech errors, you can't look in a person's mind and say, why did you say consuade? But you can infer it pretty much from this theory, which is you equally activated two words. You can't say two words at the same time, so you end up blending the two together. Another real common concept here, or common example and application of activation theory, is when you're looking at the stages that we go through in encoding sentences. We actually go through different stages in, not so much in a single word, but when we're talking about like sentences or phrases. And the way activation theory would explain this is, when we're activating a sentence or a phrase, we actually have multiple different stages that we go through. We activate the concepts, we activate the words, we've activated the individual sounds of the words, and we also would activate then at a later stage, we would activate things like the suffixes or the structural syntactic arrangement in a sentence. And this can also explain a lot of real common errors. For example, You ever notice how when you know how when you get, sometimes these are called spoonerisms, but there's similar things that aren't actually spoonerisms. You know how like when you get words or letters in a phrase mixed up, you ever notice how exactly symmetrically you reverse them? For example, instead of saying, I better stop for gas, you say, I getter stop for bass. Well, why, once you make the mistake getter, why would you not say, I getter stop for gas? Why is it an exact inversion? And the way activation theory would explain that is, you've already activated what the sounds are that you're gonna say, and the fact that you use the G sound to say getter, you've already used that. And that's why it's not there when you say the word gas. So by the time you get to the word gas, you're left with this B sound, that's where the better was supposed to be, and so you simply put that in there. Again, if it wasn't for this kind of exact symmetrical inversion of these mistakes, there wouldn't be any reason why you wouldn't say, I getter stop for gas. You're much more likely to say, I getter stop for bass. Again, what's happened is you've activated those sounds. Since one sound gets used in one place, you make an exact inversion and put the sound that should have gone there then in the other place. And it doesn't have to be just the beginning of a word. Another one that I had down was something like, instead of saying brake fluid, you say Blake fluid, where again, you see the exact inversion. You've used the L for brake and said Blake instead of brake. Well, that leaves you this R sound lingering out there. You've already used your L sound, so that's already been used. That's not still there to use. So then when you say fluid, you end up saying fruit instead of fluid. Again, it's an exact inversion. Or instead of saying bed bugs, you say bud begs, right? I mean, what you've done is you've taken that middle sound, the U or the E, and you've done the exact symmetrical shift. So not only is activation theory explaining things like our conceptual stimulation of words from concepts and concepts from words, it even indicates that we have different stages of activation. We've activated the letters and the sounds, and if we use one someplace that it doesn't go, we've already used that sound, and so we just plug in the other sound, and that's why most of these speech mistakes are exact symmetrical inversions. And another fascinating thing is, now there is an alternative way that some of these could be explained, but that's the assignment of things like suffixes. Typically we assign the pronunciation of a suffix, at least according to this idea, after we've already said the word. But what's interesting is, if we make a mistake in the word itself or the phrase, we still assign the correct pronunciation of the suffix. Now, that probably sounds real confusing to you right at this point, but let me give you an example. You're going to say a house full of cats. Well, instead of saying a house full of cats, you say a cat full of houses. Well, not only have you made the mistake of saying a cat full of houses instead of a house full of cats, you notice that you use the correct pronunciation of the suffix, the plural sound. Because if you say a house full of cats, the S phonetic sound is the S sound. But if you say a cat full of houses, it's a Z sound that you use for the plural, not an S sound. So the way this could be explained is, in your mind, you've already made the mistake of saying cat full of house instead of house full of cat, and then after that mistake is made in the mind, you then activate the correct pronunciation of the plural and have the Z sound that would go with houses instead of the S sound that would go with cats. Do you see what I mean? Another example there would be, instead of saying the prongs of a fork, you say the forks of a prong. Same exact thing. Prongs is the Z phonetic sound for the S. Forks is the S phonetic sound. So you've made the wrong statement, prong full of forks instead of fork full of prongs, but you use the correct assignment of the pronunciation of the suffix for the S for the plural, which indicates the multiple stages. In other words, in your mind, you've already made the grammatical mistake of shifting the words around. And then, secondarily, you assign the pronunciation of the suffix, but you correctly assign that because that occurs after you've already made the mistake in your mind of shifting the words around. Just think of how fast all that stuff is going on in your mind. Another example, not just with suffixes, but even with something like an article, you know, like a or an. You know how you use an when it's preceded or when it's followed by a vowel, but you use a when it's followed by a consonant. Well, if you make a mistake in the word, generally you use the correct article that goes before the word. So let's say that what you mean to say is an ice cream cone, and instead what you say is a kaiserine cone. Well, yeah, you've made the mistake of saying kaiserine instead of ice cream, but you used the correct article. You didn't say an kaiserine cone. You're much more likely to say a kaiserine cone instead of an ice cream cone. So again, the idea in terms of the stages, you've already made the mistake in your mind of saying kaiserine instead of ice cream, and after that mistake is already made, you then assign the article a or an, and you correctly assign the article because you've already made the mistake. So you see the rationale, and again, just think in terms of how fast, some of this stuff is going. Now, there is an alternative explanation for some of that, though, and that's just a matter of speech conditioning. We become so conditioned, but still I think this could be explained within the context of activation. It's just a little different twist on it. We become so conditioned to and before a vowel and a before a consonant that if you say sometimes, try to say and as a mistake before a consonant, and it's almost difficult to say, and ball. I mean, it's almost like you have to force yourself to say that because it just doesn't come out naturally. We're so conditioned to using the and before a vowel and the a before a consonant that could explain why we do that. But even that still falls within the purview of activation theory because you most frequently use and before a vowel and a before a consonant, so it makes sense that you're going to activate the correct, article a or and before you use, after you've already made that mistake. So again, just some fascinating kinds of examples here when you're talking about things like the multiple different stages even that we're going through with activation theory. Another good kind of extrapolation, now this is a little bit outside the idea of language processing, but it is important to point out that activation is not just language related. When you're talking about activation theory, it's really multi-dimensional. In other words, activation theory is talking about all kinds of conceptual stimulation that's going on in the mind. It's not just language related, and we have so many other examples of activation that is not so much just language, or at least it's involving more things than just language. For instance, haven't you ever been in a particular place, and maybe you remember why or not why, but you're in a particular place and all of a sudden you're overwhelmed with a particular feeling, and it's because you associate that place or a place similar to that with some emotional experience. Now sometimes you can recall why. Oh, that's where I proposed, was a place like that, at a Yankees baseball game or something like that. Sometimes you might not remember it at all. Sometimes you might just have that feeling and you don't remember where the association comes from. Don't you a lot of times even associate feelings or memories with something like a smell? And again, one of the examples I use in classes is something like you walk into some place and all of a sudden you're thinking about back in the young days when you used to go to grandma's house at Christmas time, and you may or may not recognize the association that somebody's baking oatmeal raisin cookies, and that's exactly what grandma used to bake, and so you smell the cookies and then that activates the memory of, that nostalgic feeling of the young days when you're at grandma's house. Many other kinds of examples. Another one that maybe some of you have had, maybe you're like walking around your house or something like this, and you're thinking of something, and then you go to another place in the room and you sit down and you can't remember what you just thought of. Do some of you go back where you were when you thought of it? Even that sometimes works. You thought of this while you were in the kitchen, and by the time you're sitting down in the living room, like let's say you're working on a project in school, and you're in the kitchen making a cup of coffee, and some idea comes to you, and then you go back and you sit down at your desk, and you can't remember what that was. Sometimes you walk back into the kitchen where you were standing, and then the concept comes back to you. Well, it's not that there's anything physically in the kitchen necessarily that stimulates that memory. It's just the idea that you even could make the association between that spatial location and the thought that came to mind right there.
So could you say that activation theory could possibly explain feeling of deja vu?
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah, would you elaborate a little bit there? That's a really good idea.
Like, when I get deja vu, it's like I feel like I've been here or done this already. So like maybe like something in my behavior or something, and my even like my cognitive processes in that moment combined with something else made me think of a moment in time where I did the same thing.
Or a similar thing?
Or a similar thing.
Okay, some of that could be explained by activation. Now, there is a whole nother theoretical explanation though for a lot of deja vu, at least visual deja vu experiences. Typically, when the mind processes visual images, you become cognitively aware of what you're looking at, of a micro moment, which is 1/1000th of a second before it goes into your short-term memory. For some reason, sometimes, that neurological process gets reversed, where the visual image goes into your short-term memory about 1/1000th of a second before you become consciously aware of it. So what's the sensation? I've seen that before. Yeah, it was 1/1000th of a second ago is when you saw it, but it's just the idea that a lot of the deja vu feeling is, that's in my memory, I remember seeing it, and we just don't recognize that it was 1/1000th of a second ago. Some visual deja vu can be explained that way. Now, there's other kind of deja vu that couldn't be, but that's one common theoretical explanation for deja vu. Were you gonna say something else? No. But still a good concept, a good idea, and some other kinds of deja vu can easily be explained that way in terms of activation. Another good kind of example is if you're trying to remember a name, doesn't sometimes associating a visual image activate the name? Picture somebody's face, and then you can remember the name. Or sometimes you even kind of do this, almost like when we were looking at our semantic network and how the different concepts are related, off of another, off of another, off of another. Don't you sometimes trace like a path of activation? Let's say that you're trying to remember a character's name in a movie, and you can't remember the character's name, so you start off here thinking of, well, what was the movie in general about? Well, here was that one scene in the movie. Here's that one conversation they had in that one movie, and then all of a sudden you remember hearing that person say the other person's name. So what you've basically done is kind of traced a little network there where you can't directly access what the character's name was, but the things that are more closely associated, you remember the movie, you remember the theme of the movie, you remember a critical scene in the movie, you remember the conversation they were having in that scene, and then you can remember the person saying the person's name in that conversation. So what you've done is, it's kind of like saying, you can't directly go from, you're trying to remember the name down here where the person's name really is, because that's too much conceptual stimulation and you can't activate it, but you can activate this thing because it's closer, and then that can activate this, and then that can activate this, and then that can activate this. Just like, again, on our semantic network, you're not going to directly go from street or from red to street. That wouldn't be a very direct activation, but you can see if you go from red to fire engine, and then from fire engine to other vehicles, and then other vehicles to the concept of a street, you've sort of, through a series of, intermediary steps, you've gone from one concept and you've activated on through to the others. Again, lots of examples and applications. So, just kind of, go ahead.
Okay, so, could you say ADD is almost fit into activation theory, because I have ADD, so sometimes if I don't take my medicine, you'll say something and it'll activate a multiple thought processes that I can't control until I realize that I'm activating it, and I'm okay, I gotta go back.
Oh, if I understand you correctly, are you kind of talking about over-conceptual stimulation?
Yes.
Like you think of something, and instead of being able to keep your focus on this,
Yeah.
it's like a dozen things are activated at the same time.
Yeah.
What a brilliant application, and I see you nodding there too.
Uh-huh.
What a brilliant application of activation theory in terms of the attention deficit disorder that for some people have, where it's not always that you don't have the mind power to keep a focus of attention. It's there's so much conceptual stimulation going on. You think of one idea, and instead of that just activating this related concept, it like explodes into a dozen different kinds of ideas and a dozen different kind of concepts. That's a really good application. Now, I have not seen activation theory be used as an explanation for ADD, but I know that explanation for what's going on with ADD, exactly what we're talking about, is essentially applying the idea of activation theory, even though they're not necessarily using that concept or themselves. That's a really, really good application. I bet for a lot of people that's what happens exactly. Yeah.
No idea.
What?
Said you have no idea.
Well, I don't have ADD, but I know the idea.
Oh,
in
you
terms
have
of
the idea, yeah.
Thinking of something and 150 things
I don't have
come to
ADD.
mind off of one, yeah.
Right. Ooh, a squirrel. Wise. This way.
And in a way, it's kind of frustrating, isn't it? Because basically what you're doing then by medication, and I'm not saying anything against the medication, I know it has really good purposes.
Oh, yeah.
But what you're really doing then by the medication is you're kind of
Suppressing.
deactivating your conceptual stimulation. It's like you're dulling your conceptual network there, and I can understand why a lot of people would not wanna do that. It's like, gee, I'd rather let my mind just run wild rather than drug it down where I'm under-stimulating and under-conceptualizing, yeah. I can understand that frustration. So, activation theory, can you see why I couldn't give you just a simple description in the beginning or a simple definition? I mean, everything we've been talking about basically explains activation theory. The underlying idea, though, is conceptual stimulation, what it takes to stimulate words from ideas or ideas from words. Your two most important variables, frequency and strength. The more often things are associated, the less conceptual stimulation it takes to activate it. The stronger the association, the less conceptual stimulation it takes to activate it. The semantic network is a good illustration of that. Concepts that are more directly related and more closely related. These are concepts that are more frequently and more strongly associated. Therefore, the lines are shorter and the lines are more direct, meaning that there's less conceptual stimulation to go from one thing to the other. The things that are further apart, longer lines, more indirect paths, these are the things that are not as frequently and not as strongly associated, and that's why it takes more conceptual stimulation to go from A to E than it would to go from A to B or B to C or C to D or D to E. Applies both to encoding and decoding. Lots of our examples of encoding, going from that thought to the word, are examples of different kinds of speech errors, like the tip of the tongue, the Freudian slip with the tip of the tongue is at least a speech gap, you know, the Freudian slip, the blends, those kind of things, and then a lot of kind of examples of decoding as well, and then the stages, and then the multidimensionality. This is one of the theories that has some of the most practical applications. I mean, you can really use this a lot. You know, the more you understand how the mind operates, the more control you have over what the mind does. And when you understand how the mind is operating when we're conceptualizing things and remembering things, then you can really do that. I mean, sometimes, again, I don't want to get too far off track here, but sometimes even think of how you remember something. You know, like if you're trying to remember something and you finally remember it, you know, ask yourself, well, how is it that I remembered that? And try to actually become aware of the process. How did I find that memory in there somewhere? And really, a lot of times what you're doing is, you know, the memory is in there somewhere, and it's like you're sending out all these neurological impulses, trying to conceptually stimulate the right place. Once you conceptually stimulate the right place, that's when the memory or the idea comes back to you. Where you can kind of become a little more in control of that process by recognizing, okay, where exactly, you know, should I be looking for that memory? And, you know, you have a little more control over that kind of process. But I think that's a good explanation of activation theory in terms of trying to remember something. You're sending out all these impulses, trying to conceptually stimulate, and when you finally get to the right one, the light lights up. You know, a good analogy here, you know, like if you're dealing with an electrical current, you've got the positive and the negative, you've got the positive down, and you've got to find the right thing to the ground, to the negative. You can go through all different kind of places, and if the light doesn't light up because the circuit doesn't complete, but as soon as you get to the right ground, then the circuit completes and the light lights up. And that's what we're sensing here. We're basically looking for that circuit completion. And we can recognize when it doesn't happen. That's how you can remember something, what something isn't, even though you don't remember what it is. And once you get the right circuit, it's completed, you've conceptually stimulated the idea.
If you're trying to do that, say, if you're having trouble with a study guide, for example, and you're more or less meta-thinking, aren't you kind of couldn't that kind of backfire in the sense that you're looking to find the stimulation to remember a key point, but then when you go back, you have to remember where you remembered that key point.
Yeah, you could lose track of yourself, in other words? Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's the kind of thing that the more often you do, back to frequency again, the more often you do, the probably easier it is to do. But if you're not used to doing it, you could actually end up sidetracking yourself. I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that came to my mind when you were saying that, and it's another good example of the multidimensionality of this activation process. For some of you, when you're taking a test and you can't remember what the answer is, don't you go back and visualize your notes? Where you actually picture your notes, and you say, okay, I know what page that's on. And then it's like you're recreating the visual image, and then you're looking for it. What you're trying to do is visually activate the visual memory, which would then, of course, you know, bring up what the conceptual idea is that you're trying to remember. So it's just a fascinating thing in terms of that multidimensionality of activation. Questions or comments or anything? Just a very, very, very broad theory in terms of its theoretical scope. And again, I'm keeping the focus more here in terms of you know, a relatively narrow focus in terms of our language processing, but I'm sure that a lot of you can make the conceptual leap in terms of how many different things that this can apply to, not just, you know, our basic encoding and decoding language processing. Julie?
Could like the activation theory kind of differ depending on like what kind of learner you are? Like that example you just gave, like if you're a visual learner, then yeah, that would help you, but if you're not a visual learner, then like you would have to go through a completely different process to kind of figure out certain things you're trying to remember.
Absolutely. You're still doing activation, it's just that you're doing a different kind, you're activating different things, right? If you're not a visual learner, then you might be more likely to be activating it or associating it with something else. Yeah, absolutely true. And again, I mean, this is, you know, a little on the edge here, but, you know, we do have multimodal memory, and basically multimodal memory means that we have memory for all different kinds of things. I mean, we have visual memory and auditory memory and experiential memory and linguistic memory and things like this. And the more that we're aware, or the more different modes of memory that we use to remember something, the greater chance we have of remembering it. You've got it visually stored, you've got it conceptually stored, linguistically stored, maybe some other kind of association, and if you've got it stored 4 different ways, then it's going to be a lot more easy to activate the idea because you've got 4 different dimensions that you could activate in. And that's kind of spinning off, I think, of what you're saying. Well, that's one kind of big theory, and again, you can see why it's inferential. I mean, you can't see these things happening directly, but activation theory provides one of the most logical, simple kinds of explanations for a lot of these processes. Another language processing theory is, well, let's not say it's just language processing, but there's a whole variety of different kinds of theories that deal with language comprehension. What would be the best way to outline this? I think the best way would be to go ahead and put this as language comprehension, and I'll just deal with the 2 different theories as substrate. Language comprehension theories. One big language comprehension theory, and again, this is how we understand and associate meaning with words, is what's referred to as top-down processing. Now, I do some of this in even the interpersonal class when we're talking about things like the influence of semantic context on processing language. The basis of top-down processing of language is that external stored information interacts with language symbols. Actually, it interacts with any kind of signal or symbol system, but we're applying it to language here. The idea is that as we're processing language, it interacts with external knowledge that we have stored. We're not really just processing the language. We have all this external knowledge of other things as well, and as we're processing the signals or symbols with language, that's interacting with our other stored knowledge that we have about other kinds of things. The general idea of top-down processing, now that gives you a little more of a complex explanation, is that when we're processing language, both words and meaning are processed in relation to semantic context. And this is the idea of that stored knowledge and interacting with the words, interacting with the language. Semantic context basically is the overall idea of what are we talking about? It's sort of the overall idea in terms of what's the contextual meaning here. Well, that's a lot of external stored information. We don't think about this a lot of times, and again, it's just a phenomenal thing in terms of how fast and automatic this is happening in the mind. Most of the time we think that when we're processing words and meaning, we're just processing the word itself and the meaning of the word without realizing how much the mind, at the moment that we're hearing the words and we're hearing, assigning the meaning, we're processing that in relation to what our stored knowledge is about the world and about other kinds of things. Classic example of this, and again, it's both words and meaning, is how easy it is to recognize a lot of words that are not correctly pronounced. I mean, most of the time, people do not pronounce a lot of words correctly. If you just come across a word "ta" by itself, what in the world does "to" mean? But when somebody says, I'm going to go to the store, you don't have any problem at all. You don't even think about it. You just automatically process the word "to" as the word "to," because you recognize the context. So that's that stored knowledge, is when you hear the whole sentence and you understand the semantic context of the whole sentence, the mind will automatically process the word, even though the word's not pronounced correctly, process the word correctly because you understand the stored context, even though the word "to" by itself doesn't seem to have any meaning. Or if you come across a word like "gonna," you know, by itself, that's no word. I don't think there's a word in the English language that's "gonna," but yet somebody says, I'm gonna get up at 8 tomorrow morning, you don't even think about it. At the moment you hear the word "gonna," you automatically process it as meaning going to. You're processing the correct meaning, even though it's the incorrect word. How many times do people pronounce the word "have" and "have" the same? But in the semantic context of a sentence, you don't make that mistake. Somebody says, I have to get up early in the morning. What, you're only going to get up a fraction of the way? No, you don't have to get up in the morning. You have to get up early in the morning. But the moment we hear that, we recognize that in that context about getting up in the morning, that's something you have to do, not something you have to do. On the other hand, if somebody says, give me half of the pear or half of the apple, you just automatically process it as the fraction. Even though in both situations, I have to get up early, give me half the pear, you say it exactly right, the mind processes the same exact word, at least the sound of the word, in two entirely different ways. Because you recognize, in terms of that external knowledge that we have, you recognize that when you're talking about getting up, it's have, not have. When you're talking about a fraction of the piece of fruit, it's have, not have. Another example that I use sometimes is somebody says, when you're at the store, stop off and pick me up a pound of butter. Well, how many times does somebody come back and say, I looked all over the store and there's no product in that store that's butter, B-U-D-D-R, there just wasn't one, so I got you nothing. Well, when you hear this, I mean, what are you actually processing? When they say butter, you hear, I mean, it's almost like you even think you hear the word butter. You know that's what they mean because you understand the context rather than just hearing the incorrect pronunciation of the word and saying, gee, I don't know what that product is. Can you see this is some of the difficulty that people have in learning a second language? And this isn't just with English, but with any language, you've got the formal language, which is the way everything's phonetically supposed to be pronounced, and then you've got the day-to-day conversational use of the language, which is quite different than the way it's supposed to be pronounced. One of the difficulties, there's a lot of people that have really good book knowledge of the formal phonetic pronunciation of a language, but yet when they go to that country and they're talking to people on the street, you know, they still have difficulty understanding the person because they're using all these incorrect pronunciations and things like this, and you're used to only processing the correct pronunciation, and that's why something like conversational French is much different than actually the formal book learning of French. What language are you thinking of? Because I see you nodding.
Spanish. I lived in like a Spanish community kind of before I came here, and I knew so much more Spanish than I do now.
When you actually live in a culture, that's a great thing for the study abroad programs to do and stuff like that. There's actually let me come back to you just a second.
I don't really have a question. I was just like, I don't think butter is pronounced wrong when you say butter instead of butter.
Well, it is.
But it's like a T, like it depends on how you say your T's. It's just like a.
Yeah, if you say your T like a D, then.
But no, because I'm not saying D, I'm saying butter. I'm not saying butter, I'm just saying butter.
Cause doesn't butter turn into
It's
almost
just-
two words? Butter, like
Yeah, it's
you
like-
have to
it's
put
like a
ladder,
proper
like
T.
say ladder.
You know what's a good example of though? How easily we just become accustomed to the word. Because, I mean, it is butter. It's B-U-T-G-E-R.
I know, but if somebody said butter to you, you'd be like, okay.
That would actually
you're
stand
weird.
out as unusual because we're more used to the incorrect pronunciation than the correct pronunciation. But again, when we hear this, and actually what you're saying is a really good example of this. When we hear this, our external knowledge, we so often associate that this actually is the word, you don't even stop and think about it. You
It's
don't
like
even stop and
like
recognize.
Well, yeah, so
poor and poor. You know,
Yeah.
you pour me a glass of water and you have no money, you're poor, but everyone just says,
Poor.
you know, oh, you're poor.
Sure. There's a whole another set of examples that brings up.
I don't know, someone like, it stuck out to me, someone pronounced the word button, like button. He said button, and I was like, I've never heard it like pronounced like that, but I guess.
Mitten.
Oh yeah, look at how often people just ignore the T's. Mitten, kitten, you know, those kind of things. you don't mispronounce the T, you just like leave the T out. But again, the mind processes it as the word it is. How often do people leave out the G at the end of ing words? You know, I mean, they do it all the time, and yet the mind just kind of reads that in there.
My name is pronounced Keaton, but no one can pronounce it right because they go over the T. They call me Keaton with a D.
Okay.
So I always go through it, or they like skip the T and the D off, like Keaton. Like
And just kind of
Keaton.
eliminate that in there,
Yeah.
make it a contraction almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I took a linguistic theory class last semester, and this was a common argument that my linguistic theory professor was talking about. Like, linguists talk about this and been talking about it for decades. Basically, it's a phonological difference that essentially it's the placement of your tongue in your mouth, and some people just, if they speak quicker, talk faster, Michiganians, whatever we are, people in Michigan, yeah, they, apparently we talk faster than most other accents in the country, and so the double D and the double T's are commonly meshed together. We're outside of the Midwest, it's not, but again, if you look at the phonological and the morpheme scale, like how you're supposed to pronounce it, linguists across the world will differ about this stuff, so there's technically no right or wrong way, but it's how it's perceived with the English language.
Yeah, I mean,
Everybody's right, everybody's wrong.
I'm glad you bring that up. None of this is saying it's right or wrong. You know, nobody's saying that when you say butter, it's wrong. We're using that as an illustration of top-down processing, that when somebody says a word that's not pronounced correctly, it's not that there's anything wrong with that, because the mind processes it the right way. Okay, go ahead.
Well, just going back to like this too, like just the slang, like in learning Spanish, it really does make a difference because like I've been learning it, like studied it in school, but like speaking it to real people like that are like natives and stuff like that, it's so different. Like
Different.
it's completely different.
It just has a really neat kind of, you know, now a lot of you already have your careers and things like this in mind, but there's a lot of job opportunities overseas for college graduates to teach English as a second language. Now, you're not teaching English to people that don't speak English. What you're doing is you're teaching people that already know English in terms of the classroom book learning of English, but what they haven't learned is the day-to-day conversational English. And so really what you're doing is you're teaching, and this is why you don't have to be an English or a foreign language major to do it, you're teaching the conversational English to people that already know the phonetically precise English. I'll come to you in just a second, Julie, but back to one of the things that Caitlin had said a moment ago, in terms of how odd it would sound for people that use some of this correct pronunciation. If you ever listen to some people from England talk, they very often use the very phonetically precise use of the English language. That's why a lot of people in England think that we have destroyed the English language. Now, it depends upon where in England, and it depends upon class and things like that, because England is very class-conscious kind of thing. But if you're looking at upper crust British society and that kind of thing, very, very, very phonetically precise. Julia?
Well, I was just gonna say, like, going off of what everyone kind of said, like, if you go to a foreign country and they're learning English, they're gonna learn it as butter, not butter.
Exactly.
I know, but I feel the T is my thing, like, I can feel myself saying the T, like the tongue placement is there, I'm like, butter, but it's not like a hard.
It doesn't sound
But it didn't say mitten.
You see the difficulty again in people learning the language. Off of the mispronunciations for a minute, because let me say one other thing about the words, even though we're still relating to the words. This has actually been studied, and in one particular study, again, this has been studied quite a bit, but in one particular study, when they extracted individual words out of the context of a sentence or a conversation, people's recognition of some of those words were less than 50%. In other words, when you just hear the word mispronounced itself out of the context of the sentence, there was less than a 50% recognition of what that word's supposed to be. But when you put the word in the context of the sentence, and they hear the whole sentence, recognition was around 90 to 95% or even higher. And what that's just absolute proof of is this idea of top-down processing. In the context of the sentence, you have no difficulty making out what the word is supposed to be. Out of the context of the sentence, you might not recognize it. And another thing, and this isn't just words, but also meaning. Look at how we make sense of all of our homonyms. You know, homonyms, those are words that sound the same, but they mean different things. There, and there. Is it the T-H-E-R-E? Is it the T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E? Or is it the T-H-E-I-R, the third person plural pronoun? Well, we don't have any difficulty day to day making sense out of which there somebody means. If you just heard the word there, you have 3 different meanings. But in the context of a sentence, it's over there, the book is theirs, they're coming over at 8. You don't have any problem at all recognizing which one it is because you recognize it in the context of the sentence. Back to a spin-off of some of the things you were saying, Dave, in terms of words. Did you say R and R?
No, poor and poor.
Poor and poor?
I mean, it's spelled differently, but it's...
But a lot of times they're said the same. Well, look how many people pronounce these 2 words the same. R and our. You know, a lot of times people go R, and they're meaning both of these. But we, in the context of a sentence, we don't have any difficulty making sense of that. Or some of our other ones, like 2, 2, and 2, is it T-O, is it T-O-O, or is it T-W-O? In the context of a sentence, you don't have any difficulty with that at all, because you just automatically recognize what it is. 1, 1, are you talking about 1, O-N-E, or are you talking about 1, you won the game? But in the context of the sentence, we can easily know it. Here and here, is it the sound that you hear, or is it the location here? What about the 5 rights? Right, 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 and right.
Jesus.
Right, your constitutional right. Right, you are correct. Right, the direction right. Right, R-I-T-E, like a ceremony or a ritual. And right, W-R-I-T-E, which is what you do with your pen. 5 complete different uses of the sound right, but in the context of a sentence, you don't have any difficulty recognizing what those are.
The Wright brothers too.
What?
The Wright brothers too.
Oh yeah, and even the name, okay, W-R-I-T-E, Wright Street, that kind of thing. One of the, again, there is some more to talk about this, but we are getting close to break time. One of the, we don't get into it this much in here, but I'll talk about this a little bit in sometimes, a lot of times when I do the listening section in my interpersonal class. On a lot of these kinds of things where they talk about things like backmasking in music and, you know, secret messages in music and stuff like this, what a lot of the research has shown there, that if you just play these things backwards, most people don't hear anything at all. But when you make the suggestion to people, like, listen, and don't you hear this when I play this backwards? Then, all of a sudden they go, wow, yeah, they hear it. What you're basically doing is, you're influencing top-down processing. Once you plant that seed in their mind, you make that suggestion, they already have that semantic context, and it's real easy to read phonetic sounds that might not sound anything like that if you didn't have that seed planted in your mind, but you hear, once it's planted in your mind, it sounds just like that. And you can even take the same part of a song and give different people different explanations of what it says, and each group thinks that's what they hear. Now this isn't backmasking, but one example of this was at the end of the Beatles song Strawberry Fields, when there's, in one of the tracks, they're chanting, you know, as they're fading out. And some of you know the thing that John Lennon masterminded, the idea that Paul McCartney was supposed to be dead, and you know, and they sort of replaced him.
Movie about it.
Even though, you know, McCartney is one of the only 2 that's still living. Well, on the end of that Strawberry Fields, they say that that's one of those messages about Paul being dead, because if you listen real carefully, you can hear them saying, ha ha, we buried Paul, ha ha, we buried Paul. The exact same part of the exact same song was said to be a drug-oriented message, that if you listen really carefully, you can hear them saying, smoke pot, everybody smoke pot. You give it to one group, the exact same thing, and say, do you hear the smoke pot, everybody smoke pot? They go, yeah, yeah, yeah. The exact same part of the same song. Do you hear them saying, ha ha, we buried Paul, ha ha, we buried Paul? Yeah, yeah, yeah. You get 2 completely different things in terms of what people think they hear, just by planting that semantic context in their mind.
I was gonna ask, is that concept the same as priming? The one, top down, you know, you say, listen for this, can't you hear this? Is that the same as priming?
This example is the same as priming, yeah. One other thing, just real quick, and again, I use this in my interpersonal, so for those of you who had me in interpersonal, you recognize this. I'll use the example of saying something like, the haystack was important because the cloth ripped. Well, you notice why there's ambiguity there? You understand the words, but if you don't remember that from interpersonal, what you're missing there is a semantic context. And we model this a lot of times as a pyramid, where the context is up at the top. And if you're missing the context, then a phrase like, the haystack was important because the cloth ripped, doesn't make any sense. How easy is it to activate context? You say one word, the word parachute. Now you say, the haystack was important because the cloth ripped. Just by saying the word parachute, at the moment you hear the phrase, you automatically interpret it semantically in relation to that visual image. Or the notes were sour because the seam split. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense because there's no context. You can activate a context with a single word, bagpipes. Now you say the notes were sour because the scene split. You have a really clear visualization of exactly what that's saying just because you activated the context. The more complex one that I use is, with hot gems financing him, our hero bravely defied all scornful laughter that tried to prevent his scheme. An egg, not a table, he said, correctly typifies his unexplored place. Now 3 sturdy sisters sought truth, forging along through the calm vastness, but more often through the turbulent peaks and valleys, while doubters spread fearful rumors about the edge. Does anybody remember what that context is there? That makes no sense at all. Do you have one?
No, none.
I mean, not only does it influence your perception of the meaning, but if I was to ask you to remember those phrases, even your recall would be very low. Look how easy it is to activate the context, and then I'll say it again. Christopher Columbus, with hot gems financing him, our hero bravely defied all scornful laughter that tried to prevent his scheme. An egg, not a table, he said, correctly typifies this unexplored place, round, not flat. Now 3 sturdy sisters, Nina Pinta Santa Maria, sought truth, forging along through the calm vastness, but more often through the turbulent peaks and valleys, while doubters spread fearful rumors about the edge, until at last welcome winged creatures appeared, signifying momentous success. Every single phrase, every single sentence is just crystal clear in your mind. As soon as we activate that particular semantic context, you automatically process everything in terms of that context. So this is really a phenomenal kind of processing thing that the mind is doing, both in terms of the recognition of words as well as recognizing meaning. One other real quick one, and we'll still do our 15 minutes for break. I don't want to cheat us out of our break time. How often it is that people get a complete misunderstanding of what a song means. They've activated the incorrect context in their mind, and as they listen to the words of the song, they're interpreting it in relation to that incorrect context, and that's easy to do. One of the examples I used in the interpersonal class is how many people think that the Police's song that Sting wrote, Every Breath You Take, is this pretty beautiful love song. Every breath you take, every move you make, I'll be watching you. It's not a romantic love song. It's about a stalker. It's not every breath you take, I'll be watching you. It's every breath you take, I'll be watching you. I mean, it's an evil, wicked kind of thing. Now, one of the reasons people make that mistake is because we do psychologically react to music, and the music is a beautiful musical structure, and it feels like it would be a positive thing, but it's really a very negative thing. Or how many people misinterpret the U2 song, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, as a guy's search for his loved one, like a romantic partner, when you get later on in the song and you really look at the lyrics or see the movie Rattle and Hum or read some interview by Bono, it's talking about a man's search for religion, not a man's search for his wife or something like that. So it's really easy to do, though. When you activate the wrong context, you can even interpret things in the wrong way. One other quick example, don't you see this a lot of times in comedies and movies where 2 people are having a conversation and they each think they're talking about something completely different, yet everything that one person says makes perfectly good semantic sense in terms of what the other person thinks they're talking about. So really you have 2 completely different conversations going on. Each person has a context activated in their mind, and everything makes sense in that context. And it's not until something's finally said that seems to really stick out, that doesn't make any sense, that you actually understand what they're talking about. Were you going to say something, Dave?
I was going to say that Sting song gets messed up in our generation because of Puff Daddy's version about Biggie, so everyone, Notorious B.I.G., so everyone thinks it is about.
I think this was last year sometime when I used that example in the interpersonal class. There was some guy in the class, and either he had used it or was planning on using it as a theme song in his wedding. And he told me that I ruined it for him now, because now that song, every time he thinks of that song, it creates these negative feelings, not something that he wanted to associate romantically with his wife. Okay, let's still do our 15 and we'll come back.
Close your mouth, and then finish out. Oh, I just went home.
You work there?
That's why I wore the stucco shirt. Well, I'm sure I could get my hands on a stucco shirt.
How long?
You going to Starbucks?
No, I gotta go. Huh? Yeah, I gotta go. Yeah. The big project.
Is Diane preparing for her presentation tomorrow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
worried are you for Monday?
For the exam?
Yeah.